Hello and welcome to Unacademy, the one-stop solution for an English medium UPSC aspirant. Today, as part of the Hindu analysis, we'll be discussing 6 very important articles out of the Hindu newspaper. But before we begin, it's very good to see you all again, and we have a very important announcement for you. And the announcement is that we are starting with special sessions on the Unacademy app. These special classes are live classes which are free of cost, and on the Unacademy app, you just have to log in. There are 4 sessions which have been scheduled for you at 1, 5, 6 and 8 p.m. At 1 p.m, we will have IR Fundamentals with Chethan sir. With me, you will have History Revisited at 5 p.m. Thereafter, Economy Simplified with Shyam sir at 6 p.m. and Polity Basics by Sarmat sir at 8 p.m. Now, the concept is very simple and straightforward. For your preparation, what we are going to do is we are going to discuss certain topics which are quite important. For example, in the history session, we'll be discussing temple architecture. You just have to log into the app. All of the links to these classes are given in the description box. You just have to follow the link. You have to then go to the app, download the app, and then you can just join us live at this point of time and enjoy and understand these topics. There are plethora of topics. This is a standard protocol which we will have every day at 1, 5, 6 and 8 p.m. for this week till 13th. We will have these topics with me, Chethan sir, Shyam sir and Sarmat sir, and we'll be discussing very fundamental topics for your preparation. This is a very important announcement. Remember, it is a free class and it is a live class on the app. Remember this. And as I said, the link is given in the description. Now with this, let's look at the topics we'll discuss. We have 3 major topics and 3 topics which are prelims oriented. Now, ironically, the Hindu has now started to give a new edition. If you know, you know, there's one Delhi edition and there's a new international edition. Now, the page numbers of these 3 are out of the Delhi edition and these are out of the international edition. So remember this point that these 15, 15 and 12 will match with the international edition of the paper. You don't have to read it. We are there for that. But this is out of the Delhi edition of the paper. One is micro credentials. Thereafter, a very interesting data out of an RBI survey. And thereafter, the UCC will discuss the history of it, what is the colonial background to it, and what is the headway in regards to that. Thereafter, the bullet train, Odisha and a cargo bay which has come up, and over that a very important new record by a Russian cosmonaut. So, if you know my sessions, if you've ever interacted with me, you know that I operate in 3 basic ideas. One is I will tell you the concept first, the basics first, then I'll go into the nitty-gritty. Nitty-gritty means the description, the important points, and then I'll give you a summary. Throughout the session, I'll keep on making you learn something. We'll revise as we go on, and the concept is very straightforward. We'll have multiple revisions and you will learn in this session itself. You don't have to learn it separately. And over and above that, I will give you the basic idea, the whole picture first, and then we'll read the article together and understand what it wants to say. Now, the first topic is micro-credentials, and it's an important article because of the fact that it comes from the chairman of the UGC itself. And therefore, it is talking about a new concept which is emerging, which is called micro-credentials. Now, this is the basic gist area. I'll first create the whole picture in front of you, and then we can go into the details as much as possible. Now, he's used 2 terminologies which you should remember and know for the examination. One is called micro-credential and the other one is called macro-credentials. Now, micro and macro is basically based on the fact that on the duration, these are short duration courses and this is basically a long duration course. Now, what the UGC chairman is arguing is that with macro credentials, which is basically, for example, a BA Honours or a BTech, which takes more than 3 years or 3 years and 4 years, these are becoming more and more redundant in getting you employment. So, macro credentials or macro courses are becoming more and more problematic when it comes to employability. And the way you bypass this is basically by getting micro credentials. And this is a very important point he's making, a new point he's making in that regard, wherein you have macro credentials, BA Honours, BE Tech, whatever course you are doing more than a year, it is basically a macro credential. Macro credentials, though important for examinations, for example, but are not getting you employment. On the other hand, what he's arguing is micro credentials are what we need today to basically make this gap go away and cover this gap. This gap can be done by what we call as upskilling and getting industry relevant degrees or skills. And in that context, micro credentials become lifelong learning programs in that regard. So you have macro credentials and micro credentials. Now, for the examination, first this term itself is very, very important. That what is a micro credential? Micro credentials are basically credentials which you've picked up through small short-term courses, basically upskilling or skill development as the government calls it. And this will help you in basically seizing the gap or crossing the gap between a macro credential and a micro credential. Macro means big, micro means small. So macro would mean a long-term course. On the other hand, micro would mean a short-term course. Now, the first part of the article establishes why micro is important. The second part of the article tells us that in order to make sure that macro credentials are in a way added by or enhanced by micro credentials, and micro credentials remain important in the larger context of India's demographic dividend and how the youth is going forward, the argument is that there needs to be certain standards. And the standards, his argument are, first is that we have to have a relevant assessment model, which is that, for example, if I am taking a certain course, and if I'm not able to assess if it is good enough or not, then it is a problem. So there needs to be a model across India, specifically from the government, wherein micro credentials can be accredited that they are good enough. First is assessment model. Thereafter, the next most important concept is that he says that there are two bodies which need to get integrated into the micro credential concept. First is called the Academic Bank of Credits, which is basically called ABC, and the other one is called the National Framework for Credits. Now, what do you mean by this? See, if you're in a BTech program, even if you're in Delhi University, in any university right now, you get credits for what you do as a course. 3 credits, 2 credits, 4 credits, standard. Now, what he's arguing is that these micro credentials should be converted through the National Framework for Credits into credits 1 point, 2 point, 3 point, whatever it may be. And National Framework for Credits thereafter should be able to be integrated into the Academic Bank of Credits, in which you can add this. For example, you had 20 points or 20 credits. You can add to it by doing these upskilling programs. And by doing that, you make it 22, 24, therefore industry relevant understanding. Now, further, what he's arguing is that if we are not able to do this, and if the student cannot encash the credits he's getting in the form, or she is getting in the form of micro credits, then there's no point of this whole industry itself. So there are two basic points which this article is making. It's an editorial, important because of the UGC chairman itself. Is the first, the concept of micro credits. Second, the gap between employability and the concept of macro, what we call as credentials and courses which we are doing. Second is, how can we make sure that the upskilling which is being done today by multiple institutions are up to the mark. First is a good assessment model. Over and above that, we also have to make sure that the Academic Bank of Credits and the National Framework for Credits both get integrated into this program. So there are two basic points I'm trying to make here. As always, this is the macro picture or the larger picture of this article. Now we can go into the further points made by the article, and then we'll give you a summary. So the first point which this article makes is a very straightforward one, which is that there's a gap between how higher education institutions are giving knowledge to the students and how it is related to the employability of that student, and generally how higher education and the larger courses which we do, and it is not a lie that basically whatever we are doing in school or in colleges today is not very industry relevant, and therefore you need to bridge that gap between, for example, only studying C++ to know now Tableau, which you have to do separately. So therefore, yes, there is a gap, and this is a very important point because this gap can be a problem in encashing our demographic dividend. We're a very young country, and therefore we have a very youthful population who wants to work. But if we are giving them macro credentials which are not industry relevant, we are making sure that they will not get employment, and therefore the workforce does not increase. Therefore, India does not go forward. For the new India, what is needed is basically what we call as micro credentials. Now, how does he argue what is a micro and macro credential? Micro credentials are short duration learning activities which are done with a standard and reliable assessment process. Over and above that, it could be in any model. Hybrid, online, physical, does not matter. This is in contrast to what we know as macro credentials, which are basically undergraduate degrees, which are now becoming more and more irrelevant in that regard. If you've done a BA Honours, if you've done a basic Masters, it is not very relevant. You have to give NET, you have to give other professional degree examinations so as to get certain form of employment. And therefore, micro is important in that sense. Now, he argues that if micro credentials are made a part of the larger system, then the path of lifelong learning has been opened. Basically, working professionals do not have any certain age or a basic age bracket, and you have to be relevant to the market, to the industry as you go forward, and therefore working professionals need to be a part of this micro credential program. And while you get credits in a formal degree by the time you spend in a lecture, tutorial, these are certain things in the concept of micro credentials. It has to be how you have shown competency, that are you competent after that program to do something. And herein lies the second part of the discussion, which argues that there are 4 things we have to do in order to make sure that micro credentials can be the new industry standard. First is we have to make sure that the assessment method is reliable. If I am doing a certain course, that certain course is giving me the exact skill and it is industry relevant or not, should be done through an assessment model. Herein the government or the industry or under PPP, which is public-private partnership, we have to create a certain framework. Second is, it makes no sense to do these courses if they cannot be portable, which is that you can use these credits otherwhere, and stackable, which is you can create from 20 to 25 to 30 and create a certain credit score for yourself in what is called as the academic bank of credits. This is a new concept which is emerging. The national framework for credits is already there, which is they create a certain model in which you have to get certain amount of credits and they are decided in that regard. So the national credit framework is quite important in that sense. And last but not the least is our higher educations should also develop certain things for themselves, which is that it should not be that Google or other private institutions are having upskilling programs. Why is it that cannot the universities of India have a micro credential program itself? So what is the gist and what is the basic takeaway here? The basic gist and takeaway here is you have to remember the term, and this is what I'm going to always do with you. I will give you basic things which you have to remember for sure. You have to remember the term which is micro credentials. Thereafter, you have to remember the terminology called ABC, which is academic bank of credits, and thereafter the national credits framework or the national framework for credits, the same thing, the CNCRF, and these terminologies now become relevant for prelims generally and for your GS paper 2 and 3. In that regard, that you can get how education is important, governance and other issues related to upskilling in that sense and economic upliftment. And what you have to remember in this is that the concept of assessment is very, very important. The concept of integration is very, very important. And the concept of our own higher education institutions developing something is very, very important. So the gap between your degree, which is a macro concept, and getting employment has to get covered by the concept of micro credentials. This is the basic point you need to understand in this article. It's a new terminology. That is why important. I have a mains question in the end for this. Now, with this, we move to the second article. The second article is a very interesting one. We all study about Panchayati Raj institutions, PRI, very important, the third tier of governance in that regard. Very, very important in that sense. But this is an RBI study which gives us a very alarming concept and a very alarming figure. Now, we already know that the Panchayati Raj institutions operating at the Gram Sabha level or the Panchayat Samiti or the Zilla Parishad level, we already know that is a static polity in that regard. Over and above that, we know that they have a very important responsibility at the village level, from agriculture to rural housing to water management at the Zilla Parishad level. Even hospitals, schools and irrigation programs are run by them. And Panchayats can earn certain amount of revenue through taxation of professionals, trade, land revenue, stamp and registration fees and property tax in that regard. Now, based on the level and profile of PRIs, which is Panchayati Raj institutions, we can realize that they are a very important level of governance. We know that. Now, in that sense, a very important word comes in, which is autonomy. PRIs should have autonomy, should have the right to do what they want to do, and in that regard, their autonomy is very clearly linked with their fiscal autonomy, which is that if they are not financially sound and if they are getting only grants from the center and the state, that in turn increases the interference of the center and the state, and therefore there has been a lot of conflict in different states where the PRIs, where the Panchayats are fighting for their independence. Now, the question with regards to this is a challenge. This is basically a challenge wherein the concept of autonomy and independence of the Panchayati Raj institutions comes in, and therefore, if Panchayati Raj institutions feel threatened by the way they are going forward, there needs to be a fundamental overhaul in the way they get their money. And in that sense, what RBI has pointed out, and I have the different boxes and tables out of the newspaper itself, and let's analyze what is the core issue. Now, you see, chart number 1 tells us that out of 35,000 crores, which was the money which was received, receipts, which is basically the receipt or what was received by the panchayats across India for 2022-23. If you look at the breakup of this figure in crores, which is this 35,000 crores which they got, the most alarming development is this. 24,000 crores was actually transferred by the center as a grant in aid to these PRIs, and 8,000 crores was given by the state, which is again a problem because there's a gap. There's a gap in the center contributing and the state contributing. And over and above that, their own fiscal health and their capacity to actually get any form of revenue is extremely low. Is extremely low as compared to the money which they got. This is added by, if I go to every panchayat, this is average revenue per panchayat, which is every panchayat, how much revenue it is getting. You see, 21,000 is what they get from their own tax revenue. And 1694 is in thousands, 1694,000, which is close to 16 lakh rupees, which is coming to them from the center. And therefore, if I convert this into percentage, then the real picture comes in. This is the revenue per panchayat percentage, how much percent they get from which source. 1% of all its receipts, all the money they receive is their own. 80, close to 80%, 79.8, 80%. And I have not given you the figures because they are irrelevant for your examination. What is more important is the trend. 80% of all the money which they use, they get is central government. And the state's contribution is already alarming, but this is where the central intervention or center or state intervention increases multifold. Now, why am I discussing this topic? For two reasons. First, you can get a trends-based question in the prelims examination saying that most of the revenue, or it can say majority of the revenue of the PRIs or the what we call as panchayats are from state sources. No. Are from their own sources. No. Are from central sources or from the center itself. First. Second, in the mains examination, again I have a question for this, is how the autonomy, the independence of the PRIs is a governance question, GS paper 2 proper, wherein how does this data fit in there? RBI is saying that with 1% tax revenue only coming from their own sources, it only shows that they are dependent on the center and the state. And therefore, as a level of governance, they are not autonomous. They are literally looking up. It's a top-down perspective in which they are always looking up for certain form of money, and receipts are not natural to them. This means that either the structure of how they collect taxes needs to change, or their structure of governance needs to change so that we can reduce this and increase this. More than that, what RBI went further and saw was that if you look at the data as per their contribution into the state GDP, it is literally meager to none. For example, it is only Kerala and West Bengal where 60 lakh or 50 lakh rupees is the average revenue per panchayat across the state. Over and above that, if that is converted into percentage share, you see 0.1% of state GDP is panchayat share in that regard. This is again alarming. The UP is the only one where 2.5% of the state GDP comes from the panchayats. This is alarming because this shows that when we are going from center to state to the last level, which is the PRIs or the municipal corporations, are equally in this type of position, but we are talking about panchayats. So the Panchayati Raj institutions are literally struggling if there is no grant in aid from the center of the state. This is why this data is very, very important. I'll reiterate it to you. You don't have to learn the data. I told you the importance of the panchayats. I told you where they get their revenue from. This is a very important point, where they get their revenue from. I've already told you that in the news, there has been multiple panchayats or Panchayati Raj institutions which are fighting for their independence. And this can be seen in the form of their fiscal health. And therefore, if you look at the data in crores of all forms of money being transferred to the Panchayati Raj institutions, own tax revenue is very, very low. If I convert it into percentage, it becomes 1%, which is very alarming in that regard. That is why the article itself says panchayats earn only 1% of their revenue through taxes. Most of the revenue comes from center and state as grants. And this is the data which I showed you right now. And in the end, if the panchayats are not going forward, it also brings down the state GDP, because then the state GDP contribution of the panchayats is extremely low. So, what is the takeaway here? Again, I'm going to give you a basic understanding and the takeaways here. Every topic, basic takeaways. The terms were important for the first topic. Here you have to remember the trends. Trends wise, 1% is the only percentage which is basically coming from their own tax revenue, which basically tells us that either the tax model is problematic or they don't have avenues in that regard, which is both ways problematic. The second would be their independence or their autonomy, that this is the mains issue. This is the mains related issue. And thereafter, if 1% is coming like this, the contribution of panchayats or panchayati raj institutions in state GDP is also close to 0%, which is more or less nothing. And therefore, what is the way forward? The way forward is that you either make sure that the structure changes, or at least the revenue structure changes, or we are giving them new opportunities and avenues to generate more revenue. It's a very important point with regards to this. So the first two articles, first we discussed the concept of micro-credentials. Now we have discussed the concept of how PRIs are struggling in that regard. And now we'll move to the most awaited and the most important topic for today generally, which is basically the UCC or the Uniform Civil Code and Uttarakhand. Now here again, I want to give you a bigger picture and then I want to discuss what is happening in Uttarakhand. Now, the genesis of UCC, the Uniform Civil Code, is basically historical. People don't talk about it, but it is actually historical. See, if you have done your modern India, if you have any idea of modern India, you would know there was a class of officers in the British, who are called basically the Orientalists. The Orientalists, such as Hastings, Colebrook, Mackenzie, Orientalists were the ones who basically believed in an extension of what Robert Clive calls hands-off policy, which is that we don't want to fundamentally change anything in India, and we will use the Mughal institutions or the old institutions, they had become ineffective. We'll use them again and act like white Mughals, which is that we have just changed the structure. We are wheeling colonialism in the way of these old institutions, and therefore there will be no rebellion because the people will think that we are just like the Mughals. We are no different in that sense. Orientalists basically want to respect Indian culture in a way, and they want to use the old institutions also, and they also do not want to, and remember this point, they do not want to fundamentally change anything. And under the Orientalist project, we have the Asiatic Society of Bengal, we have the Sanskrit College, we have the Calcutta Madrasa, but a very important concept for the Orientalists and for Hastings was creating a new judicial structure. And in creating this new judicial structure, in which we have the Nizamat Adalat, the Diwani Adalat, and the Sadar Nizamat Adalat and the Sadar Diwani Adalat, Diwani being revenue, Nizamat being criminal, the concept was that they always wanted to use religious intermediaries. This is Hastings' understanding. Religious intermediaries should sit with the European judge in order to assess any form of judicial order or concept. Now, the concept is very simple. Hastings argued that if we have a Maulvi, Qazi and a Pandit, the people will again think that we are using old institutions. Now, in the process of doing this, what the Orientalists did, they created what is called as Hindu law and Muslim law. Now, basically the holy law of Islam is Shariat itself, and there is nothing called Hindu law exactly at the time I am talking, which is this 1770 to 1790, 1800 period. Now, Hindu law and Muslim law are nothing but British interpretation and codification of Indian law regimes. For example, in Hindu law, they added the Manusmriti, the Dharm Shastras. Shariat was converted into Muslim law itself. But the difference between Muslim law, what the British created, and Sharia would be that Sharia was much more interpretive and much more flexible. It used to change over a period of time. But Orientalists and the British had what we will call as a basic urge, an obsession with codification. They were like that if we can codify everything, this is standard legal history, this is called the history of judiciaries and legal history of India in that regard. Codification is something which they wanted. Now, Bernard Cohen and all have done a lot of what we call as research on this, but Hindu and Muslim law basically got codified into what we call as Hindu and Muslim law, as we call it today in bare acts in that sense. So the origin of this concept of having laws for different religious communities is basically coming from the British origin, which is we did not have this system. We had books, but we had never codified these books. So Hindu law, Muslim law, the concept of this religious space and law separately is an Orientalist project in that regard. Now, at the time of independence, we knew that this concept of Hindu and Muslim law, other than the IPC, the CRPC, is already problematic, because what is Muslim law is not what the Muslims or what we call the Islamic jurisprudential or what we call as scholars think of it, or the Muslim population thinks of it. It is the British lens of Muslim law. Basically, I have not produced Hindu law. The British has produced Hindu law for me. And therefore, the lens becomes the British. And therefore, there were certain problems in Hindu law also, certain problems in Muslim law also, and generally all forms of religious laws or what we call as interpreted personal laws, there's a problem. Because it's a British interpretive understanding of the Indian subcontinent, and therefore they become problematic. Now, the way to undercut this, the way to in a way remove the colonial sense out of this was called the UCC, the Uniform Civil Code. Civil Code because it is based on personal law in that regard. Now, UCC was something which the British could never produce, because for them divide and rule was very important. Therefore, dividing us into categories was very, very important. However, at the time of writing the constitution in 1947 to 49 period itself, there was a major push, or there was a major understanding that should Uniform Civil Code, UCC, become a fundamental right, or should it be a DPSP, which is Directive Principle of State Policy, that the state should be directed to go for UCC and not become a fundamental right itself. Now, at the time of drafting the constitution, there were two basic factions. One argued that if we go for UCC, which is an argument till today, we basically are undercutting Article 25 today of the fundamental rights. It was Article 19 at that point of time, but Article 25 of the fundamental rights. And in a way, it will remove the unity in diversity, the diversity of India, the religious principles of different communities. That is what makes India, India, which is our religious diversity, our diversity in different forms of culture. Now, the other aspect was that, for example, K. N. Munshi argued that no, UCC does not take away Article 25. It rather adds to India becoming one whole unit, and it is something which is important at the time of independence. Now, when it came to the drafting committee, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar took a compromise. He said that let's not take UCC as a fundamental provision. It is a purely voluntary provision. If the government of India wants to put it, it should put it. If not, therefore, we should not go for it as a fundamental right. He kept it open. It was an ambiguous response. So when it came to the Fundamental Right Committee, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, he basically said that UCC should not be a fundamental right. We'll put it into DPSP under Article 44. Now, once this has been established, since the promulgation of our constitution, there's been a lot of debate that should UCC be brought in, and the Supreme Court in that sense is a very important body which could do something about this. Now, whenever it came to the Supreme Court, Shabano case or any other case, the Supreme Court has always said that UCC is something which the government should strive for. However, it is an exclusive domain of the government to do something about it. The judiciary will not intervene. Therefore, now under the rights of the constitution, the parliament is capable of implementing UCC. It has a right to, and there was a challenge recently that how can Uttarakhand develop its own UCC. However, the Supreme Court again argued that under Article 162, it has a right to do it. Now, this is basically the gist of the history. There are other provisions what Uttarakhand is trying to implement, that is something separate. What I want to do again is to tell you this story now in a little bit of a fast forward manner. Understand this point that UCC fundamental issue comes out of the concept of the British interpreting our law and creating Hindu law, Muslim law, Colebrook being one of the pioneers in what is called Gentoo law or Hindu law, the concept is they codified everything in a perspective of their own. And therefore, there's an issue with codification. There has always been this question. At the time of independence, this question came up and the compromise was taken, which is that let's keep it as a DPSP and not as a fundamental right. But this question has come up from time to time with regards to gender equality and how, in a way, certain personal laws and religious laws discriminate against certain communities, certain genders, and therefore UCC, the concept is the Supreme Court has said that every state and the center is liable to and is in a way, it has the right to implement a UCC for its own. And therefore, what is happening in Uttarakhand is not illegal. Now that you know this perspective, I can go into the nitty-gritty. So I hope that I've established in front of you something which is quite fundamental. I've given you an academic level understanding because this concept of Orientalism codification is not something you'll find in standard books such as Spectrum or Bipin Chandra. I'm giving you a very high level of understanding when it comes to what is the fundamental issue with personal or religious law in India, which is British codifying it from a British perspective, which is divide and rule and generally not understanding rituals. The basic point is the British were never capable of understanding Indian rituals and therefore they should never have been the people to codify something. So now with this perspective, I hope that you understand it. Let's understand what is UCC. So UCC seeks to create a uniform set of laws for the personal law for every religion pertaining to marriage, divorce, adoption and inheritance. That is basically what is UCC. Uniform set of laws for all religions in India when it comes to marriage, divorce, adoption and inheritance. Now, under Article 44 of the Indian Constitution, it says it directs the state itself that we shall endeavor or the state should endeavor to secure for the citizens a uniform civil code throughout the territory of India. This is where the DPSP concept comes in. Now, I want to discuss the origin of this and therefore I go to the debates which happened in the Constituent Assembly. So, one with the opponents in that regard who wanted it to be under DPSP and not under fundamental rights, they argued that it would violate the Article 25 today, Article 19 of the original Constitution, therefore taking away the freedom of religion and restricting the morality or the health of people. That was the argument given by members such as the Nazaruddin Ahmad. On the other hand, K.M. Munshi argued that UCC does not defeat the principle of freedom of religion, rather it makes religious practice a part of social reform so that any problems which the British may have codified into these laws can be removed or we can reform in that regard. Now, what was the compromise? The compromise was Dr. Ambedkar argued that it is a purely voluntary concept when it comes to UCC, though desirable, it is purely voluntary and it can be a recommendatory concept. It should not be something which should be maybe not put into the fundamental rights. And therefore, when it went to the subcommittee under fundamental rights headed by Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, by 5-4 majority, UCC should not fall under fundamental right and it was pushed under Article 44 of the Indian Constitution as a DPSP. Now, what has the Supreme Court argued over a period of time? Supreme Court argued under Shabano case, Shabano Begum case that Article 44 is a dead letter. We should work for it. We should do something about it. Thereafter, under Salah Mudgal versus Union of India and John Walatham versus Union of India case, again, same point was made by the Supreme Court that we should strive for UCC. And over the years, and this is a very important point, the Supreme Court has argued that the directive to the government, since law-making falls within the exclusive domain of the parliament and therefore it will refuse to give any judgment, and this UCC is under the exclusive domain of the parliament. And recently when the Uttarakhand government tried to go for a UCC, it was taken to court. There again, Article 162, the Supreme Court quoted and said that it is under the right of the state government to go for a UCC under Article 162. So what you have to remember is Article 44, Article 162 here, which is very, very important for you because under Article 44 it is a DPSP, state or center, and thereafter 162 because Article 162 gives the state the rights to go for UCC in that regard. Now, This is the backstory. This has to be written in the examination, and this is a very relevant question for the mains examination. I put in this time to basically give you a certain perspective, in that sense that you understand what is the Supreme Court stand, what is the stand, or what was the stance of the Constituent Assembly, and where the debates are. Now, once we've established this, which is that the center and the state both have the right under 44, under 162, both have the right sanctioned by the Supreme Court that they can go for UCC. Then there are other sub judice issues and issues which need to be discussed. Uniform Civil Code, in a way, yes, brings uniformity. That may be a problem in the context of Article 25 or generally the culture of India. But there are much more fundamental issues, in a way, which have been codified as personal law. So when we talk about personal law, and this is my own perspective, this is my own opinion, and therein we have stopped reading the article in that regard. When it comes to personal law, the center and the state have the right. When we talk about UCC, yes, UCC is a good thing. It can be something which can remove the colonial issues. And this is a point which people don't talk about or really don't know, in that sense, is that, see, personal law should never be about uniformity. Sure. UCC will try to resolve that. But the need for UCC also is there not because it is a discriminatory practice, just because it is gender related. It is also because the laws which we see today, the whole codification, that is why we had the need to amend the CRPC, the IPC, the Indian Evidence Act. And therefore, the concept of amending personal law and creating UCC is also a process of decolonization. Therefore, the colonial issues which are embedded within the personal laws, Hindu law or Muslim law, can only be removed if we go for a reform in the form of UCC. And therefore, to be very honest, to be very clear, obviously the government is more capable of understanding how to implement it, but the concept of this colonial angle needs to also bring in, or should be brought in that regard, wherein you understand that there are other colonial issues also related to UCC. The very important point I'm trying to make here is because it's an Orientalist project which, in a way, messed up our legal system also. And that is why the British kept on changing the judicial system, and it was Bhagat Singh, no one else, who showed us that rule of law in India during the colonial period was nothing but the rule of the British. He made a mockery out of the whole judicial system in order to show to every Indian that legal systems created by the British in India were just to serve the British, and therefore personal laws in that regard also have that imprint. So I hope that I'm trying to basically go beyond what is there already in the news and give you a certain theoretical understanding that could fetch you marks in the paper. Now, with this, what are the changes which Uttarakhand is proposing? Under that, it is talking about gender equality, treating men and women as equal. It is now going to revoke practices of marriage and divorce, in which you have what we call as polygamy. That is one argument of Uttarakhand. Then the concept of iddat, which is mandatory period of waiting, which has to be observed for women after the resolution of marriage, and triple talaq. That is something which they're doing for Uttarakhand specifically. They will also change the inheritance law within Muslim law itself, where only 25% of share was given, in order to bring it up to what we call as the central laws, which basically at least equal share should go to the daughter and to the son. And they are not changing the minimum age of marriage, but basically it's about marriage and divorce. Fundamentals are being changed both in Hindu and Muslim law. Now, with this we finish the first three topics, which are generally mains oriented big topics. So the first topic we discussed, and this is the third revision I'm doing with you, please revise with me so you don't have to go through the session again. The first topic we discussed, we understand the concept of micro-credentials. Micro-credentials in order to bridge the gap between the macro, which is degrees, and employability. Second topic we discussed was the issue of how there is a fiscal structural issue within PRIs, Panchayats institutions, where only 1% is being generated from their own sources and 80% rely 80% on the center in that regard. And the third topic which we discussed here was the UCC or the Uniform Civil Code and Uttarakhand in that regard. I've established that why it was put into Article 44 as a DPSP because of the debates within the Constituent Assembly. I've also established that under Article 44 and 162, Supreme Court has already said that it is the right of the center and the state to do it. They can do it at the state to state level. Then the center may change it for the whole of India itself. And we have also established that the need for UCC also comes in from the colonial origin of personal laws in that regard, what we call as Muslim and Hindu law. So with this, let's move to the prelims oriented topics. We will do the mains questions in the end and then we can end the session. So first is just an update for you because we have a bullet train project in India and 39% of this project has already neared its completion. The 47.4% in Gujarat has already been done, 22% in the Maharashtra section. You don't have to learn this. It's just a basic update to you that this is also nearing completion, maybe in the next 2 to 3 years. The basic point is all forms of land acquisition in Dadra Nagar Haveli, Maharashtra is nearing completion again. And we should see this in the news. It's just a general update for you with regards to that. Second is Odisha or Odisha. Odisha has recently opened up a new cargo bay. Global air cargo flights and bay will now be there at Bhubaneswar airport. This is because obviously we know that Odisha is in a very, very important belt of iron and steel, and therefore a new cargo operations has been started for international flights. And the first international flight went to Sweden with regards to it. And the basic point of this is that the state has a very good export potential for steel and iron, and therefore if they have international linkages with different countries from Bhubaneswar airport itself, it brings down the cost of transportation. Therefore the cost of our steel will go down, in turn making it more competitive in export markets. Last but not the least is a Russian cosmonaut called Oleg Kononenko, who is basically now the only human on earth who has a world record for being in the space. 878 days and 12 hours cumulatively since 2008 he has been in the International Space Station, and he has now set a world record for that in that sense. Now, we have discussed 6 topics, 3 big, 3 small. 3 small topics you can just revive, remember the name, the concept of an update on the bullet train, and last but not the least, the concept of Odisha now having an air cargo bay or air cargo operations internationally. What is more important for you is this, which is the mains questions. The first question deals with the first topic, which is micro-credentials could be the key to our demographic dividend. Analyze. It's a beautiful question which can go under GS paper 2 and 3 both. So please do try to practice this. Second, 150 words. Second, the key to the autonomy of Panchayati Raj institutions in India is their fiscal autonomy and revenue. Discuss. This is a GS paper. Again 2 because it's a governance issue, and 3 because it's an economic issue. So therefore it becomes relevant in that regard also. Now before I end, I just want to reiterate and point out to you that at 1 PM we have Chethan sir live on the Unacademy app with certain issues and certain fundamental issues for the examination. He will be talking about certain fundamentals of IR. Then at 5, I'll be there with temple architecture on the app live again. It's a free session. And thereafter at 6 PM, we will have economy simplified by Shyam sir. And in the night at 8 PM, we have the blockbuster session, Polity Basics by Sarmat sir, where he'll be again talking about certain issues which are fundamental to your preparation. All of these sessions, links are given in the description. I hope that you will join us for these sessions in that regard. With this, I would like to end the session. Thank you so much. I'll see you tomorrow with another set of issues from the Hindu newspaper. I hope that you like this session. I tried to give you more than what the newspaper is trying to talk about. Thank you. Take care and bye-bye.